Hello everyone and welcome to Reading with Cosmo. I'm your host, Cosmo, and today we'll be reading a classic bestseller entitled Lincoln on Leadership, Executive Strategies for Tough Times. This is a book written by Donald T. Phillips. Now, I'd like to thank everyone again for listening in, tuning in, and hearing this wonderful book. We'll be reading the introduction today. I've read this book multiple times. It's a really great book. Let's see here. There's 4 parts in this book, 15 chapters. It's only 189 pages, so it's not too bad to read. So let's get started here with the introduction on page 1. Introduction. Throughout the relative brief history of the United States, there have been many great leaders. Several, such as Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and the Roosevelts, became presidents. Others, like Franklin, Webster, Anthony, and King, made a dramatic impact on mankind without reaching the White House. There are countless other leaders, on both local and national levels, in all aspects of society, who could be labeled as great. Yet there is one person who rises above them all, one who is consistently ranked as the greatest president, one who is viewed as the greatest leader this nation has ever known or will ever know, and one who, although dead for more than 144 years, still inspires and moves people from all walks of life, from all around the globe. That person is Abraham Lincoln. It is not surprising that our vision of Lincoln today is more mythical than real. His role as the embattled Civil War president and savior of the nation was magnified after his assassination, and with time his enduring image as the great emancipator has catapulted him to a level near sainthood. In addition, the labeling of Lincoln as Honest Abe, the rail splitter by the media of his time, has been perpetuated for well over a century. Every school-aged child in America knows about Abraham Lincoln. Thousands of books and articles have been written on various aspects of his life. Moreover, the image of Lincoln is everywhere. His likeness is on the penny, the $5 bill, saving bonds, and certificates of deposit. There are countless statues, photographs, paintings, and sketches of him throughout the United States and around the world. His likeness adorns courtrooms, schools, public buildings, and private residences. There have been plays written about him, along with movies, television programs, magazine articles, songs, and poems. His name has been associated with motels, automobiles, toys, banks, organizations, streets, and objects too numerous to list. In addition, his letters, notes, written speeches, and autographs are in demand all over the world. With all this exposure ingrained in the American stream of consciousness, it's easy to see why the distance between the myth and the reality of Lincoln is still very wide. In fact, it has only been in the last several decades that Lincoln enthusiasts have begun to explore the real Lincoln and, at the same time, trying to separate and downplay the myth. Curiously, with everything that has been written about Abraham Lincoln, little is known about his extraordinary leadership ability. This is perhaps because leadership theory itself is a relatively recent phenomenon. Only in the last 10 to 15 years has the study of leadership been examined closely, and not as part of the management philosophy of the business world. In a way, Abraham Lincoln represents the summation of those leadership qualities that had helped to form a nation. The last great leader before industrial change, Lincoln stood for all that was right, honest, and self-evident. As a boy, his heroes were the founding fathers, and he studied the history of a young nation that was so devoted to human rights. He grew up in poverty and had a binding link to the common people. He was innovative at a time when the age of discoveries and inventions was just beginning. He was compassionate and caring, yet, when necessary, could put his foot down firmly and be decisive beyond question. He was patient, persistent, consistent, and persuasive rather than dictatorial. But without a doubt, the foundation of Abraham Lincoln's leadership style was an unshakable commitment to the rights of the individual. Interestingly, in many definitions of leadership, there are a few references to this basic concept of human rights. James McGregor Burns, in his landmark book Leadership, came the closest when he wrote, "Leadership is leaders inducing followers to act for certain goals that represent the values and the motivations, the wants and needs, the aspirations and expectations of both leaders and followers. And the genius of leadership lies in the manner in which leaders see and act on their own and their followers' values and motivations." As close as Burns comes to the pure definition of leadership, it still seems a shade unfinished or incomplete. Such is the case, however, with virtually every attempt at interpreting, clarifying, or defining the true meaning of leadership. Leadership is an elusive concept that, at times, can be vague and ambiguous. As a result, there are no set rules or formulas for leaders to follow. There are only guidelines and concepts, perceptions and ideas, abstractions and generalities. This is why the art of leading people is so difficult to master and teach, and why there is such a great need for role models. We must study individuals who are recognized as successful leaders, those who have demonstrated their abilities with tangible results. In short, we must look to our heroes, for it is only by examining individuals such as Abraham Lincoln that we can ever hope to understand how effective leadership really works. Studies of other well-known leaders suggest that certain factors in childhood can predispose a person to great leadership. James McGregor Burns points out, for example, that the most important influences on the shaping of leaders lie almost wholly in their early years. He observed that Gandhi, Lenin, and Franklin Roosevelt appeared to have a strong attachment to one parent, coupled with some intensively negative attachment to the other. Most of these leaders had a close relationship with their mothers, who appeared to favor them over other siblings. Sigmund Freud made a similar observation when, in the interpretation of Genes, he wrote, "I have found that people who know that they are preferred or favored by their mothers gives evidence in their lives of a particular self-reliance and an unshakable optimism which often seem like heroic attributes and bring actual success to their possessors." Abraham Lincoln similarly had a very close bond with his stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln. She was a constant source of encouragement and love to her stepson. Mrs. Lincoln considered Abraham a model child who never needed a crossword. She recalled that her mind and his seemed to run together. Lincoln spoke only in kindness of Sarah Lincoln and always called her mother. In later years, he provided for her, in part by keeping the 40 acres of land on which she lived in his name. He visited her for the last time in early 1861, just before he left for Washington to take the oath of office. They embraced, cried, held hands, and talked most of the day. To friends who accompanied him, Lincoln spoke very affectionately of his stepmother, calling her the best friend he'd ever had, and recalling the positive change she had brought about in his life. This last visit in itself says much about the attachment they shared. Here was Lincoln off to face a task even greater than which rested upon Washington, taking time to visit his mother, his earliest and strongest source of reassurance and support. By contrast, there was a major estrangement between Lincoln and his father. Thomas Lincoln grew up literally without education, as Lincoln would later write, and he never did more in the way of writing than to begrudgingly to sign his own name. Abraham, however, was more given to intellectual pursuits, which may have been the chief cause for a lack of bonding and affection between the two. The boy took it upon himself to learn to read and write, then subsequently expanded his abilities by leaps and bounds. A perfect example of the depth of the rift between the two is that Lincoln did not attend his father's funeral. When he received word that Thomas was near death, Lincoln wrote to his stepbrother, John D. Johnston, "Say to him that if we could meet now, it is doubtful whether it would not be more painful than pleasant." In addition to the complex relationship many distinguished leaders have had with their parents, Burns notes that several other similarities. Many experienced some form of tragedy while still very young. Lenin, Hitler, and Gandhi all lost their fathers at an early age. Some were forced to accept the mutual tolerance of others while growing up, such as Gandhi, who lived with his parents, brothers and sisters, and 5 uncles in their families. Virtually all of the outstanding leaders Burns studied were subject to feelings of insecurity and lack of self-esteem. Moreover, most developed a dynamic will to succeed, a driving ambition that lasted their entire lives. Compare this profile with that of Abraham Lincoln. His mother died when he was 9 years old. His sister, Sarah, died in childbirth when she was 19. After his father remarried a woman with 3 children, Abraham was forced to live in a small log cabin with 7 other people. As a youth, he was so gangly and gawky-looking that he was teased unmercifully by young girls. Through his adolescence and into adulthood, he masked his shyness by acting the clown and telling funny stories. The life of Abraham Lincoln, especially his presidency, demonstrated that he possessed all the great leadership qualities. Some of his inherent abilities were natural, others were consciously developed over the course of his life. Qualities such as honesty and integrity, empathy for the common man, and devotion to the rights of individuals were products of his upbringing. During his adult life, Lincoln's chosen profession as a lawyer prepared him for his future executive leadership position. He learned to express himself and to demonstrate to others his beliefs and thoughts. More importantly, he refined his ability to persuade, direct, and motivate people. In running for public office, Lincoln became an excellent orator and speechwriter. In fact, he so dramatically increased his ability to speak and write that he is today regarded as a model for poetic and artistic expression. Lincoln combined his extraordinary wit with a gift for storytelling to become an effective communicator. He was naturally inquisitive and learned rapidly, which led him to be extremely innovative. He is, in fact, the only U.S. president to hold a patent for a method to make grounded boats more buoyant. He had a high-pitched, penetrating, and far-reaching voice that could be heard over great distances. For example, everyone present heard the entire Gettysburg Address, and there were at least 15,000 people in attendance. Even Lincoln's height, at 6 feet 4 inches, our tallest president, gave him a psychological advantage over others. He was a man to be looked up to, a man to be followed. Assessing the accomplishments of Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States confirms that he must have been an excellent leader. How else could the Union government have worked so cohesively to win the Civil War and keep the country together in so relatively brief a time frame? What makes this accomplishment even more remarkable is the fact that he was able to overcome the nightmare he inherited from outgoing President James Buchanan. By the time Lincoln took office, 7 states had seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. Barely 10 days before he took the oath of office, on March 4, 1861, Jefferson Davis was sworn in as President of the Confederacy in Montgomery, Alabama. President Buchanan had given up hope of holding the country together and was simply waiting for his term to expire. Buchanan actually left Washington, proclaiming that he was the last president of the United States. Nor had the United States Congress taken any action whatsoever to put down the rebellion. In fact, while a bill was tabled in the House of Representatives that would have given the president power to call out the state militias, the Senate passed a resolution requesting the War Department to lower military spending. All this happened between the time Lincoln was elected and the time he took office. When he finally became president, Lincoln was faced with the realization that the South had taken control of all the federal agencies and had seized almost every fort and arsenal in Southern territory. Most of the Mississippi River, lifeblood of the nation's commerce and trade, was extracted or in Southern hands. Washington was almost completely defenseless, protected by only a portion of the nation's army, which in 1861 was unprepared for war. It was a scattered, dilapidated, poorly equipped, and disorganized array of some 16,000 soldiers, many of them Southern sympathizers. In charge was General Winfield Scott, who was viewed by many as incompetent. In addition, most of the state militias were in such worse shape than the Federal Army. Rumors persisted that Lincoln's inauguration was to be disrupted, the president killed, and the city taken by the Confederates. The nation's capital was placed under armed alert. When Lincoln delivered his first inaugural address, the nation was in a crisis more severe and ominous than at any other time in American history. The country was divided, hatred was the most prevalent emotion, and there was no effective leadership anywhere in the government. In the midst of all this turmoil, the relatively unknown Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office as the nation's 16th president. The first Republican president, elected by a plurality of the popular vote, he was a Washington outsider who was viewed widely as a second-rate country lawyer and completely ill-equipped and unable to handle the presidency. He commanded no respect from anyone in the nation except his most loyal supporters. Even the members of his newly appointed cabinet considered him a figurehead whom they could control. Politically, Lincoln was caught between the fierce abolitionists of the northern states and the slaveholders of the border states that he desperately wanted to remain in the Union. Holding on to states such as Kentucky and Maryland was crucial to the preservation of the nation he had just sworn to preserve, protect, and defend. Yet he was pressured constantly to free the slaves. Not that he was for slavery, for he believed that if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong, but the timing was not right to grant emancipation. To do so at such an early stage of his presidency would only serve to further divide the country. He correctly concluded that some, if not all, of the border states would secede if he were to call for the complete abolition of slavery. Lincoln, therefore, was faced with the seemingly unsurmountable problem of holding the nation together while at the same time organizing a new, more effective government that could prepare for an impending civil war. In his inaugural address, he had declared that the southern states would not be allowed to separate and that the momentous issue of civil war was in their hands. Yet he had no means at his disposal to keep them in the Union. That he knew exactly what he was up against is evident from his own words early in his address. It is 72 years since the first inauguration of a president under a national constitution. I now enter upon the task for the brief constitutional term of 4 years under great and peculiar difficulty. A disruption of federal union, heretofore only menaced, is now formidably attempted. Such was the situation for a man who had never before held an executive leadership position, who had been only a one-term national congressman, who had no military experience to speak of, had never been in battle, and indeed had been only an elected captain in the Illinois militia briefly during the Black Hawk War. Abraham Lincoln appeared unable to lead the nation out of its dark dilemma. Few people at the time could have known, however, that he possessed all the leadership qualities and abilities necessary to save the Union, and virtually no one would have been able to predict the unparalleled strength of his leadership, that he would seize upon the very circumstances at hand, created by the crises of confusion, urgency, and desperation, to exercise the full power of his office, and to create new limits of authority and leadership for the presidency. Why would today's leaders be interested in Abraham Lincoln's leadership style and philosophy? Because by modern standards, Lincoln's accomplishment would be regarded as no less than a miracle. There was little debate that Lincoln was the greatest leader in this country, and perhaps this world has ever known. He literally towers over more modern-day exemplars. There is no real comparison. Lincoln was the man who really knew how to lead. Lincoln is the leader who genuinely has something new to offer contemporary business and political leaders. Here are his lessons and principles. That was the end of introductions. The next chapter in our reading with Cosmo will be starting Part 1, People, and Chapter 1, Getting Out of the Office and Circulate Among the Troops. All I'll look forward to meeting with you again and continuing this fantastic book, Lincoln on Leadership, Executive Strategies for Tough Times. Once again, this is Cosmo signing off, saying thank you so much and have a great day.